Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and welcome to another episode of Data Nation. 2 days, 2 episodes back to back. And again, this is going to be another episode talking partly is a response to like sort of the uniform format announcement that Databricks made yesterday. Just with a lot of like now looking at now they've released some more documentation. There's more information, also some interesting controversies. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about that. So first, let's just talk about so basically the state of it now. So it seems like sort of this sort of initial release of Delta Lake 3.0. You have the uniformat, but essentially it really only works to allow you to take Delta Lake tables and read them as iceberg tables. So the idea is that it'll create iceberg metadata. There are a few limitations with that. One is that the iceberg metadata is written asynchronously, so you potentially have consistency issues because basically the Delta Lake table would be written, and then basically you might be writing the iceberg metadata at the same time. So there might be additional updates. And if there are additional updates, what it would do is it'll create like a batch snapshot to the iceberg metadata, which then could affect possible time travel queries, because essentially it'll be less snapshots in the iceberg metadata versus the Delta Lake data. And then there's some other challenges that are or limitations that I not remembering off the top of my head. Okay, but bottom line is that looks like the approach that they're taking is that they're just writing iceberg metadata while you write Delta Lake metadata. So there isn't like this. It says uniformat, but it isn't like what I kind of initially imagined, where this is an actual intermediary format. And I'm going to come back to that because I do think there is a need, and that should exist, and I'm going to talk more about that. But then there's also been a response regarding Databricks making this announcement, and always like the issues they've had with the term open when it comes to the Delta Lake. So no one argues that Delta Lake isn't open source in the sense that the code is open and available, but there has been controversy and criticism of Databricks when it comes to it being sort of an openly governed project. Okay, and not whether it's because of the majority, if not most of the members of the technical steering committee is pretty much all Databricks employees. But I mean, what just happened with this uniformat announcement kind of highlights that, in the sense that no one in the sort of Delta Lake developer community had any awareness that this announcement was going to make. Okay, so this wasn't necessarily like, hey, the Delta Lake project should have this as a community. Let's discuss, how this should be developed, how this, because I mean, I can definitely think of many better ways this could have been implemented and approaches to such a thing. So a lot of people in the community are like responding, saying they're like, hey, I'm a Delta Lake user, and I just didn't see, or I contribute to the Delta Lake project, and I was unaware that this was even being worked on. Okay. Showing that, hey, look, Databricks still pretty much controls the project because they're able to make such big, drastic changes and announcements with the overall developer community not even seeing it coming. Okay, even if there are non-Databricks employees, and they'll say, okay, well, issues were created and pushes were created by the issues, but the issues were created after the announcement. It wasn't like, hey, someone created an issue, and like when you take a look at sort of the iceberg, the way things work in iceberg is that they have like basically everything is discussed in meetings that anyone in the public can join. Okay, anytime there's going to be a new feature, there's a spec written up, and then that gets debated and hashed out. It takes time, which is the primary reason why Databricks probably does it the way they do it, because it allows them to do things quicker. Which again, I'm not saying that isn't of value per se, but the reason why this openness thing matters isn't about the quality of the technology or how useful. Like the Databricks platform, a lot of people derive a lot of value out of it. A lot of people like it. But the idea is that the idea of a table format, okay, is if the whole industry builds around some sort of standard, everyone is on the hook for what happens to that standard, and that is sort of the grand issue. So if you make something that's primarily controlled by Databricks, that's steered by Databricks, that isn't steered as a community governed project, and that becomes the standard for everything, for how everybody else builds their software, how everybody else builds their architecture. Okay, this creates this one really high risk fault point. Okay. Now, granted, okay, having a feature like uniformat at least alleviates some of that. If you are a Delta Lake user, alleviates that, hey, if one day Databricks wasn't around, at least these tables can be written as iceberg tables. But again, the limitations I mentioned before. Okay, and this again, I don't know if it really does address the fundamental issue. And again, the hoodie implementation doesn't even exist yet, and it doesn't exist necessarily the other way around yet, where you could read an iceberg table as Delta Lake. It just works Delta Lake to iceberg right now, and that's literally it. And basically, it's just writing an additional set of metadata. Okay, and I'll talk about like how I think what is needed to create the true interoperability that is needed in the industry, and how that needs to be done. In hopes that someone's listening and takes it on, because there's plenty on my plate at the moment that I can't personally take it on. Although I do find the idea very interesting. Okay, so essentially, you have this thing where basically Databricks puts out this thing and saying, hey, look, we're trying to create a more open environment among the table formats. The nature of it being sort of a announcement of Delta Lake, because Delta Lake is supposed to be open source, creates this criticism of saying, okay, hey, if you can just add things to this project without consulting the rest of the community, how does that make it? How can you argue that that project is openly governed? Okay, even if the code is open source. And then two, the limitations of it and sort of like the nature of the implementation, the way it seems like, also just kind of argues to whether it's really the right solution for this particular problem. Okay, and again, there are multiple like solutions trying to, again, I've mentioned one table, how they have like the one house has one table which does kind of the same thing, but except I don't think it's writing like iceberg or Delta Lake metadata on each write. What it allows you to do is sync your hoodie tables. I don't know if it does it on each write or if it does it on a schedule, but allows you to sync it with some sort of external catalog through some sort of mechanism. And that's fine. The problem with this is that it requires like the constant writing of all these like additional sets of metadata. What you need is sort of like a Babel, like a uniform mechanism for transpilation. Okay, and this goes back to what I was talking about with like Builder.io in the previous episode I mentioned yesterday, where they built an intermediate format. Okay, but the thing is that so basically no one actually translates. You don't translate from Delta Lake to iceberg or iceberg to hoodie. Everything is done through the intermediate format. This is actually the way I think Google Translate works, right? So I think like what happens, like the AI eventually created its own language. So when Google translates between different languages, you're not translating from like Spanish to English. Every language is mapped to this sort of AI intermediate language and then translated to the additional language, because while the AI may not understand how German translates into Spanish, it knows how German translates into the intermediate format and how the intermediate format translates into Spanish. Okay, and that just creates the moving from A to C a lot easier. Okay, it also makes it really easy for somebody to create option 4, option 5, and for it to have just perfect interoperability. So what needs to happen, and what I feel very confident will happen eventually, is someone needs to create a community-governed project. So this needs to be an independent project. Can't be part of Iceberg, can't be part of Delta Lake, can't be a part of Apache Hoodie or any of the companies, or controlled by any of the companies in one of those camps, okay? It has to be sort of an independent project that has people involved from all three camps to create an intermediary format and libraries that translate that format's metadata into the intermediary format, and from the intermediary format into that metadata. Okay, so essentially you would create 3 libraries, and you'd basically be able to translate. And then again, if another format comes along, they would just create one library and one additional library, and that would allow you to translate from any endpoint to any start point. That's what's needed, and it has to be an agnostic project. Again, it cannot be controlled by any of the three houses, if we were to kind of make this sound like Game of Thronesy. Because if you want the industry to bet on it, and they need to feel that everyone has a say. Okay, they need to feel like, hey, if one player disappears, the project doesn't die. Okay, and if you have this intermediary format, it doesn't matter what format you're using, you have an easy way to keep your data alive and usable across the entire world of tooling, really giving you the promise of the Lakehouse, where basically your data can be accessed by any tool, because it's the same 1,000 Parquet files can have metadata based on it written in any format, and it can just move around. Okay, like if you have that sort of intermediary format, then any engine could just take advantage of that intermediary format and say, okay, hey, you got a hoodie table. Let me just translate that metadata real quick. Doesn't have to necessarily write it, and they could write it and cache it. But they don't have to necessarily do it on every write. They could just write it. You could write the metadata on read, cache it as necessary, or just throw it away if it's just a one-time read. These are all things that each platform, each engine can decide how they want to handle on their own. But you create this one uniform way of creating that translation that isn't something that's built into Spark. Okay, so it doesn't have to rely on Spark. Just uses, you just write different library, probably a Python and a Java API, or basically libraries that make that translation. Okay, and then that's that. That's what needs to happen. Once that exists, then you can have, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 formats. You can have as many formats as people need for special use cases, and your table are truly portable across a data lakehouse. Because there are going to be use cases where, and there are going to be times, I think Flink has this, in the Flink world, there's another table format that's really kind of specialized for streaming, in the same way hoodies really its strong point is streaming. There's going to be times where you do want to probably, maybe write or read the data in a particular format. Like Iceberg, on the read side is magical because of the way that metadata is structured. Okay, and that's what needs to happen. So again, basic summary of what I'm talking about in this episode is just sort of the challenges that Databricks has had with trying to claim openness, because they do basically, if Delta Lake became the industry standard, Databricks takes over. Okay, that's what they want. And that's not necessarily, again, that's not saying that's a bad or a good thing. That's not my point. Okay, a company winning doesn't necessarily mean anyone lost something as a consumer. Okay, but the thing is that now everyone, basically the whole industry, becomes dependent on Databricks in the same way that what happens when the dollar became the sort of currency standard of the world. Everyone has this dependency on the U.S. that's allowed the U.S. to kind of have this sort of really, political supremacy all these years. Okay, this would lead to the same thing with Delta Lake became sort of the overt standard of how everything worked. Databricks would kind of have that position, which is kind of why they haven't relinquished full power over the project. They've been relinquishing little bits to claim that hey, the project's open-ish, but if they can maintain as much control over the project as possible, claim that it's open, and it becomes a standard. Again, they're going to have this really overwhelming political power in the industry, and that's sort of the thing. But at the end of the day, that's the reason why a lot of different players have embraced things like Iceberg and Hoodie, because there isn't that sort of hey, you seal your own fate by building this thing. But at the end of the day, Databricks is probably never going to fully support Iceberg and Hoodie, but people do need to use the Databricks platform for certain use cases. People like that platform for a reason, but people don't want to necessarily lock themselves away from everything else. So there needs to be a mode of portability, and to me that will be an intermediate format in the description that I made earlier. That has to be done as an agnostic project. It can't just be an intermediate format. It has to be in an agnostic project, because that agnostic level of the project is what's going to allow that industry adoption. Okay, not just hey, we have this pocket of adoption, but literally allow it to become a standard of how table formats on the data lakehouse can interop without, and everyone can build their tools to optimize for the formats that's best for their use cases. But your table, your 1,000 Parquet files that make up one data set, are not locked away from any format, and you don't have to have a large friction moving between these tools. Okay, because I do think you are going to need a multiple table format world, and I think in the future you're going to have specialized formats for niche use cases, but you're still going to want to have the same data, just basically leveraging that metadata and just moving it and transforming it where it's needed, how it's needed. Okay, the 3 general use formats you have now are the start. But once you have that intermediate format, you then open up the world to specialize niche formats, because you've gotten rid of the friction of being able to switch between formats mid-query for unique special use cases. So that is my thought for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. My name is Alex Merced. You're listening to Data Nation. Have a great day and have a great day. I'll see y'all later.